It is a real delight for me to introduce the last speaker for this morning, Tom Reynolds from Toronto. Tom has written the book I hope many of you know on vulnerable communion. I was first introduced to his writing in an article he had in Theology Today called Love Beyond Boundaries. And Tom comes from Toronto. He's been a part of the Institute since the beginning in spirit, and this year now in flesh. Contingencies and creatureliness of life kept him from the first two institutes, as it did for me, the first one. But we're just so delighted to have him here today from Toronto to Chicago and to kind of wrap us up for this morning. No small task, but also to say what he said to came to say. Tom Reynolds, welcome.
It is a privilege to actually make it. So I appreciate the invitations and what the Institute does. And it's actually really intimidating to go last because I'm very tempted to say what they said. Yeah, just let's go with it. Beginning with the importance of being creaturely beings loved into being by God, and returning to something like disability as not a problem to be solved, fixed, cured, remediated, normalized, mainstream, but to be honored as gift, persons with presence. And then thinking about what congregations can do and having the quantitative data basically resonate so fulsomely with what the theological talk gave. What a nice blend. And then moving into talk of limits and pain as a part of creaturely life and dementia. And I actually teared up because having grandparents who died from Alzheimer's, that talk was beautiful and being remembered as being held into the gift of community and relationships with one another. So I have nothing to say. Thank you. And nor do I hope to sum it up, but mainly, as some of you may know, to share a few thoughts on where my own passions are moving now as I care for and with my son Chris, who's been diagnosed on the autism spectrum with Asperger's. And actually I don't write much, nor go to many conferences, because it's kind of my other full-time job as well as teaching. And he gives permission for me to talk, and I actually asked if I could Skype him, thinking I could do some techno-savvy stuff with him to co-present with me, and he said, no way. So anyways, I told him that I would actually say that to you today too. But journeying with my son, Chris, inclusion has been a buzzword. And as was indicated earlier by Hans and other frames, we've talked about how inclusion is a difficult thing, held up as an ideal for and by people with disabilities, but it often leads into dead ends and partial responses. So I'm interested in pressing further than that. And I won't detail those here. I've done some stuff on that elsewhere, and there's plenty of good books out there. What I want to say is inclusion depends upon accessibility and welcome and hospitality, which themselves can be even half-hearted if communities, as John so brilliantly pointed out, are not grounded in the kind of remembering and what I'm calling intentional practices of care. And I would say remembering and holding one another in loving regard and just regard is a part of that. So a lot of this talk becomes half-hearted, and congregations really don't do the work that families are begging for them. I've never been interviewed like that, but that data that Eric presented really resonates with me. If communities aren't grounded intentionally in caring practices and values, much of the stuff we talk about as advocates and care providers and people with disabilities falls flat. So what's to be done? I'm interested in the doing. I think inclusion and access and hospitality are not accomplishments to be achieved and then put behind, but ongoing processes aimed at the full participation of all in sharing life together. But what does sharing life together mean? I I too am a fan of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and one of the words that inspired this new kind of phase in my own thinking about my life with Chris and writing about care now is his statement in this brilliant book, Life Together. And he says, we're never going to speak the word of God unless we listen with the ears of God. And I think listening is a metaphor for paying attention in relationships of care. Inclusion, access, hospitality, they all presume that a community has registered that there's a need, which presumes intentional openness and attentiveness to people, a response ableness that doesn't merely allow for participation, but actively empowers it in relationships of mutual giving and receiving, which is what I think of as care, not doing for, not caring for, but a giving and receiving in mutual relationships of loving regard. Inclusion, access, and hospitality, remembering, these are all aspects of caring communities. But what a difficult thing it is to be a caring community. These are the communities that exhibit the kind of togetherness that makes possible and reflects acts that I would suggest bear witness to one another's lives. Bear witness to one another in a way that holds, that tends, and that's open to differences. So to think about care, I've sort of come to think rather counterintuitively, like that famous pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles said, like attracts like. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. In fact, it seems counterintuitive because precisely it's the preoccupation with likeness that makes the problem, so-called problem, of disability so insidious. In fact, communities exclude others who are different. So likeness is the problem. The insidious we of group identity looms so large it's difficult to get beyond it. We tend to accept and care for those somehow like us, relating most comfortably with those with whom we share stuff, to put it kind of blithely. But what if like, in the terms of like attracts like, what if like is reconsidered beyond horizons of sameness? Beyond assimilating to become like us, or mainstream to function normally, or even included through benevolent gestures of granting space for those others, somehow deemed other. What if like comes not from what we are, something defined and given in advance, but from divine love, which rises like grass through asphalt in relationships of mutual regard and care? What if the grace of relationships produces a communion that's not an identity of sameness, but actually is a web of togetherness in connection through care? In fact, I think that's possible because communities are the sharing of gifts, not regarding differences as deficits, not problems to be overcome, but as Hans says in his work, gifts to be celebrated, not problems to be treated. Perhaps even pain is a gift to be celebrated in some ways, and I really respected the struggle with that because I too live with chronic pain. So I think of Romans 12:6. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. In my own journey, I've come to believe that it's not possible even to begin imagining what this means without reconsidering the moral postures and practices that make fruitful life together possible. I am because we are, Ubuntu. The term care for me seems appropriate and yet problematic. So I'm wrestling here today with you to recover the term care, to speak of gift giving and receiving in a communion of togetherness. I appreciate the work then done by Nell Noddings and Virginia Held, among many others, who seek in feminist terms to imagine an ethics of care. Perhaps you've read some of this literature. Eva Feder-Katay's book, Love's Labor, kind of is in this camp, so to speak. This has opened me to imagine much wider ways of thinking about my relationship with my son, Chris, who is, in a certain way, in my care. What does that mean? because often I can be close to the particularity of his difference, the uniqueness in which his life calls out to mine to respond. And in fact, his uniqueness actually is a gift I receive that allows my response ableness to give itself over. So I'm not caring for, but more caring with. And the ethics of care really begins to kind of explore this way of thinking about care that I think church communities could really benefit from. And service providers, caregivers of a variety of kinds. It's made me painful aware also of how often care is distorted and malformed, both in my own actions and within the alleged caring communities around me, particularly the congregations I've been a part of. So I want to recover care as an essential way of being human together, and more, look at it as part of what it means to be a vulnerable communion, called church, body of Christ. In fact, I think to be a caring community is to be an emblem of God's love radiating in the world, giving and receiving as a people invested in each other as gifts of God. This is incarnational, if nothing is. And so there's a whole kind of, I won't go into Christology, but I think the whole thing fits into an embodied creational dynamic of God's loving relationship for the world in care. But recovering care means, first of all, clearing a lot of ground. So I want to say a few things about that, and then talk about how I'm looking at care, and then Bill can sort of say, okay, stop. Because I don't have a watch, and I have no sense of time, and I ramble. And I don't really read. I kind of extrapolate and improvise because I like jazz. So stop me. And I really hope that we can riff together, so to speak, in more conversations as the week goes on, and maybe in groups this afternoon. But care as I mean it here, to clear some ground, is not just what experts and professionals do. So first of all, recovering care means retrieving it from the professionals to which we've given over our own care. Let them do it. Something the professionals do. Provide a service. And then we pay. So it becomes reducible to economies of exchange, as I like to say, where you do for, you pay, you get, like consumers. How often this misses the real giving and receiving aspects of care. Care is not even reducible to what happens in the many kinds of caregiving roles that all of us find ourselves in throughout our lives, where perhaps we take care of others, like babies or parents, or like I do with my son, Chris. It's there, but it's not the fulsome experience of care. And in fact, care can be missed if I think of it in terms of doing for, providing for another. Nor is care merely administrating or managing some form of beneficial assistance to another, which itself is also a commodifiable activity. It's not an industry. Think of the care industry and how, like the hospitality industry, care is trivialized in our common language about it. Customer care. In fact, care, as I've mentioned, is often reduced to interest-driven exchanges if we think of care as a doing for, a technique, a technology that can be done and mastered in order to produce a desired benefit. And why I think this is productive in the literature to augment the literature on disability is think about how disability is perceived as a problem to be fixed, and care simply means addressing a problem. So care gets co-opted in many ways to actually make worse the difficulties of being with rather than simply doing for. In less calculative instances, and perhaps even with good intentions, care is also reduced to condescension as benevolent paternalism. We've all seen this before. Debbie in her talk mentioned how people can care by sort of condescending in some of the language they've used. We don't need to go into this because the disability literature has talked, in fact, the famous book, No Pity, has talked pity, condescension, even charity, and the kind of benevolent paternalism through which churches often care for others, to go on mission trips to those faraway exotic places that keep at a distance others, because there might be something more involved that might exact something more from me. So often care in church communities that speak about love and agape creates the distance that real care overcomes. So there's a lot of ground that needs to be cleared here. Care is often meted out in a way that's non-reflexive and that actually detaches and that presumes privilege, which needs to be problematized, and can mask self-preoccupation and unjust power relations. So I'm skipping over a lot here, but just to kind of lay how much work needs to be done here. Care is shallow when it's pity or pretends to know better for another, or strategically seeks to implement an agenda occupied more with serving itself or the status quo than the good of another. I stand guilty as a parent. This is for your own good, Chris. This is for, because I know better. You know, I don't really have to listen to you. All of these instances in themselves may not even do ill or harm, but in a sense truncate the genuine good that care, in terms of what caring communities can be, are formed. Something's missing when care becomes a doing for or a know-how. In fact, care is not a techne, but a phronesis. Maybe you've heard that Greek term before, a lived wisdom that's practiced and yet reflected at the same time. In fact, I think care comes from actually not a know-how that I have before I meet another person, but actually emerges from within the fulcrum of the relationship itself. Chris teaches me how to care. And there's no better teacher for me in that regard. So care is something, for me, inherent to relationships. It happens everywhere. And there are multiple kinds of registers and levels, and I'll just name a few. They're involved in all kinds of relationships: family, friends, colleagues, lovers, conferences. I care for you. You care for me, but in different kinds of ways. Because obviously I'm prepared something for today. You're here. You have commitments that show you care. So all kinds of relationships are invested here. In fact, care is not just defined by relationships, but by a range of social domains, such as institutions, communities of various kinds, small groups, face-to-face relationships, which I'm using as a kind of baseline metaphor for what care is overall. In fact, one cares for oneself. One takes care. Take care, we say, when we bid somebody farewell. And not only social domains, but various modalities, such as supervisor, employer, daughter, student, spouse, teacher, counselor, pastor. There's a lot of different roles being played here. And the natures of these roles shift and change from context to context. So care is not one thing that can be mastered or manipulated or done. Care is a relational phenomenon that happens in many ways. So I want to emphasize the diversity that's at stake here. But throughout each level and register, there is a basic pattern of care as what I want to suggest is both a practice and a value. And it has everything to do with thinking about theology and disability. Care as a practice is an action or gesture oriented towards the well-being of persons. This is usually what we mean when we say we care for others or for oneself. There's an expenditure of energy on our part for the benefit of someone or some group, providing something that is considered a good by the ones allegedly cared for or by a relevant activist. And I use the for here because practices are often oriented towards a specific intentional end or aim. This is important for it implies the relational correlation that depends primarily, and for me this is key, on trust. Relationships of trust between parties. Without trust, care doesn't happen. And secondly, without justice and equity, care doesn't happen as a practice in the fulsome sense. So it's important to say care isn't just my gushy feelings for my son. Care involves practices that involve trust, building and making and carrying through, and also involve equity and justice. It would be unjust for me to care for Chris in certain ways. But care isn't merely a practice in this way, it's also a moral posture and value, and it's indexed by what I would call attentiveness and responsiveness to others. Issuing in a concern. We often use the synonym I'm concerned. And this concern is for the good of another. In fact, it's what I call compassionate solidarity. It involves a sense of identification with another that treats another in connection with oneself, and that connection happens on the way of desire. In fact, for me, the theology of desire is part and parcel of a theology of care, because desire animates our connectivity with one another as bodies who live in the world together. To care is to desire and be personally invested in another within what Martin Buber calls a dialogical situation. Not that literal dialogue is necessary, and Buber actually says this, but that communications of presence is at play. There's a communication of presence through word, gesture, being with, that involves sharing space in some kind of way so that a connective reciprocity somehow emerges. And that connective reciprocity is key. As both a practice and a value, then, care is much more than a doing for. It's most profoundly a being with that rises in connections of giving and receiving and what I would call mutual vulnerability. Indeed, we only respond with care by having first received the presence of another, having been summoned into attentiveness and concern through a kind of call that enlivens response ableness, a responsiveness. We come then to take care. And I think this description helps recover care as a way of being open to difference in the different forms of disability. That is, more readily disposed to engaging in relationships of mutual welcoming and ongoing accommodation. I want to be careful when we speak about care with reference to disability. And to engage in caring relationships with persons with disabilities involves rethinking care in the way that I've begun to articulate here. It means, one, moving beyond a discourse of what we owe each other by right. And secondly, equity before the law, for example. Care is invested in that, but it means moving beyond that. It means moving beyond inclusion, I would suggest as well. And thirdly, it means moving beyond sameness and likeness as it's often achieved. So in conclusion, and I think I'm okay on time, am I? Okay. In conclusion, I want to highlight the difference of disability and care vis-a-vis that. Rather than focus on what people with disabilities deserve. They deserve to be included. They, other. The whole language kind of is rife with problems. As a quality of likeness or sameness that somehow we share, non-disabled and disabled people alike. What is it that we share? What's the human? How do I relate across the boundaries of we versus they? I kind of want to focus on something that circumnavigates that. And in fact, actually kind of disagrees with what I wrote in Vulnerable Communion. It's not a fundamental humanity or an imago Dei, an image of God somehow stamped on us all that warrants inclusion if we all really got it. It's difference. In fact, its difference is something that interrupts sameness, that does the kind of unsettling move, that unmakes and ruptures what I hold in advance as same. In fact, I think this provocation needs to be called an invocation and needs to be spoken of in language that's instead of negative, positive. That's why I like the language of gift. And I appreciated the stories you told, Hans, earlier about reframing the environment. What strikes us in terms of normalcy, in terms of caregiving that seeks to remedy a problem as bad, screaming, is actually an act of communication that being with as care might actually, open up into a more fulsome flourishing. So interruption could be invocation, an invitation into the liturgy of caregiving relationships with one another. In fact, I think this may seem an odd choice to focus on difference rather than sameness and likeness, but I think taking this tack bears fruit, indeed the fruits of the Spirit, because where two or three are gathered, there is God at work. And two or three are not the same, but two or three. How often language homogenizes. In fact, the togetherness of church as the body of Christ is a gift of the Spirit that trades upon bearing witness to differences and that holds differences as gifts of grace. This is a difficult achievement, but I think it's possible. Rather than something meted out in terms of normalcy and standards of expectation that reduce us to exchange values, perhaps difference in the form of varieties of disabilities and mental illnesses and varieties of being human, the gifts we receive bring grace to church communities. Provocation is an invitation into a relational liturgy of mutual care. In fact, a koinonia fellowship outlining the nature of God's work in our midst. In his article on autism and care and Christian hope, Brian Brock explores Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan on this regard, and I want to conclude with this. He suggests that Jesus' interlocutors, and I think he's exactly right, ask the wrong question when they ask, "Who is my neighbor?" Because in asking who is my neighbor, I'm already defining likeness, proximity, closeness. Who's like me that warrants my care, my loving regard? And what Jesus does is turns the question around. Instead, Jesus inverts the inquiry to emphasize a focus on the perceiving and acting agent. To whom have you been a neighbor? Is the question. This insinuates that we ought not to expect Christian thinking about care to be oriented to and defined by a theological anthropology in advance that reduces humanity to a common core. What makes a human a human? An inquiry that easily tips into the register of defining who qualifies as neighbor, who's like us, which then leads down that road. The parable of the Good Samaritan suggests that Christian anthropology, as Brock notes, ought rather to engender an emphasis on the character of an agent's action in the present, to become a carer, to become communities of care. In fact, he quotes Paul Ramsey to make the point. Quote, "Christian love does not mean discovering the essentially human underneath differences. It means detecting the neighbor underneath friendliness or hostility or any other qualities in which the agent takes special interest," end quote. And I would add, disability, my son. I don't care with him because of an essential humanness. In fact, being a family member, as those of you who might be here with family, as siblings or parents of children with disabilities, know it even goes beyond family. It's a matter of something much deeper. So I'm convinced that love of neighbor and hospitality doesn't survive without the moral openness of care. And that means the risk of becoming open to being provoked into becoming responsive. And I think I would add to the nature, not only is to be a disciple is to remember, but to be responsive in remembering. We hold each other in such fragile relationships. And genuine care is about risking enough to receive the gift of another's presence. What I have here is a text that I've danced around, and I'll tidy it up a little bit and maybe add some things and then send it to Bill if people are interested. But I would care a lot to hear from what you have to say, because care is such a fundamentally human phenomenon, and I've only scratched the surface of a project that I'm working on. But thanks for the invitation and for being here.